what you see there, well, in this project there was something very peculiar about the way in which we were dealing with telepresence, and that was that we were never streaming video or audio. We were only streaming the very abstracted data of motion analysis that was happening through an infrared camera that was on the ceiling, aligned with the projector. So that's why you see there's the projection on the floor. The floor, then the projection area acts as the interactive stage, so to speak. And the infrared camera can look at what bodies are doing, physically present bodies are doing in that space. Now, the peculiar thing is that we were only sending to the other, we were always connecting 4 cities together, which is quite a complex feed, I must say. It's already complicated to connect 2, but this time it's always 4 at a time. And what we were sending from one city to another was never the recognizable image of a subject moving in space, but it was the abstracted algorithms of the contour of what the camera was looking at. So it was a rather abstract contour, which for me was an interesting exercise into undoing the human form, which is something I rather like to do. So rather than trying to reiterate the recognizability of human forms, I rather like to play with what happens when you have silhouettes, contours, that could almost be human, but are not quite. There's a very interesting point there, this frontier of the intelligible, where it starts to become a bit uncanny, a bit uncomfortable, where you start not to be able to recognize quite what's going on. I think that is precisely the place where these resonances starting to open, but they have been foreclosed. Maybe it's not the only place, but it's one. So here, what you see there to the right is the abstracted contour of someone who was in one of the other 3 cities that were interacting in the process. Now, the different elements of the processing of the images, color, the intensity, whatever, the blurring of the contours and other things, and also the spatialized soundscape that was being generated in real time, and it was always never just a stereo landscape. This, for me, is a very important and crucial question. Not to have a centralized hearing, like also not to have a centralized vision, if possible. This is interesting with the floor projection, because you stop having like this centralization of vision on the square wall, which I have also used, of course, but suddenly you become immersed into something that is more decentralized. But it's very important for me to have spatialized sound as well. Because hearing is always, as an embodied process, is always a non-centralized process. And I think the way in which we have produced this standardized, serialized perception of sound from the stereo system is quite a terrible way of standardizing perception, and oral perception in this case. As you may know, in contemporary music in the 20th century, there have been enormous ranges of experimentations with spatialization of sound, never for the sake of simulating existing kinds of soundscapes like you get in 3D cinema, where you see the space, whatever you call it, like in Star Wars, the spaceships going from here to there, and so you have these effects. What you get in 3D cinema, for example, in terms of spatialized sounds, is always mostly for the sake of simulating the effects of what the movie is showing. But what went on in music was rather a different process of generating spaces, sound spaces that had never existed before, which is rather the kind of thing that I'm interested in doing with digitality. So here, the sound that you get and the way the images are processed, not only the fact that the contours that you see are from the people that are moving in similar spaces in the other cities at the same time. The way in which the whole thing processes has to do with movement relations that are established between the people in the different cities. So it is again a certain degree of abstraction of the actual movement parameters as they are being analyzed in an always reductionist manner, and this is something I'm very critical with, the way in which motion analysis systems are always extremely reductionistic, and I've been using them for years. But we just have to be aware of this problem, and this problem is a very large scale, and because this is not only happening in dance and technology or in motion capture system. This happens with every single interface that we're using in our everyday life, in our interaction with whatever digital technologies. So interfaces are always capturing movement in one way or another, and you're always having to enter the regime of movement that the interface is proposing you to enter. So if the mouse moves in an XY coordinate with a certain degree of resolution, you have to enter it. You can't do it because also the mouse and the keyboard make you enter a realm of linear one-to-one relations where you press and something happens, which is something radically different to what happens with these resonances of the non-verbal embodied relationalities in other domains of our lives. So how can we recover or even expand these resonances, these irreducible resonances of bodies in motion, going back to the digital? Well, this was just an example. It didn't quite, why wasn't it quite successful, this project? And this is just one of the 4 environments that we developed. You can go on more. Well, this is the same environment here. You can see each color represents one of the cities. So I think the green was Dresden, the blue was Prague, the red was in Sweden, and the yellow is the Madrid person who's actually physically present. And you see now all the lines are very blurry or multiplied because they were all together in a way. So the proximity in this case was the parameter that we were using to generate a sense of presence. Now it wasn't quite working. Why? Because it was too abstract in a way. It became a visual effect. Which means, since we live in a culture of visual effects, which is in itself a problem, how do we produce something that, being, let's say, amorphous rather than abstract, is perceived as a presence? This is something quite interesting. It's not so easy. You can easily fall into just perceiving an effect, and that's not a presence as far as I am concerned. Well, it might be, but a different kind of presence. So I will show you, this is more of the same. Well, this is another environment. Tomorrow I might be able to show some more videos and things, but I will now go more quickly. Where we actually had abstract avatars. So in this case, the other cities were represented by amorphous architectural 3D structures that were transforming with the different movement relations that were established between the people in the different cities. So the more this person physically present would approach the other abstract avatars, the more these would, for example, deform. Maybe later I can show tomorrow more of this. I will now move on to other projects. So this was a different, very, very different project I've been working on for years now, in which I also did some telepresence experiences, although it's not the main focus of the project yet. You can go on. These are architectures I can't talk about them today, but so in this project I was using, still used surveillance cameras placed all over the body, and what you see now projected and what the body is looking at is the actual image that is being projected without any processing, just pure analog video, which is being projected in real time. Now, what's very interesting here is that there's a transposition of perception. So the cameras that are now anywhere, looking at the skin, become the eyes. So the body sees through these cameras, and the body moves through these cameras. So what transforms here is proprioception. Proprioception is a particular sense, one of the more than 15 senses that we are acknowledged to have, and which by far not the only ones. Just in case you thought we had 5, which was not the case. So that was only Aristotle's fault, nobody else's. So.
Oh, sorry. Do you want to?
Yeah, you can keep still in the previous one.
Okay.
So what's interesting in this part is how the whole perception of the body transforms through this transposition of the perception, of visual perception. Now it's very important to realize how visual, I don't know how we're doing, I'm out of time already.
A few more minutes.
Yeah, well,
you want to
I'll
show
try
a few
to
things?
run through it.
10 more minutes or so?
Very dense, but anyway. So one very important thing for me is the way in which perception has been structured, especially since the Renaissance, with the invention of perception, which according to many people was eventually the most important event in the Renaissance. The invention of perception and other technologies of vision, or rationalized vision, which is still utterly present in all technologies of visual control that are operating nowadays, from radars to 3D simulations, all kinds of things are still working on the algorithmic kind of rationalization of vision that perspective of the Renaissance produced. Now, what I think this structured most importantly was not just our seeing, which is a very important thing already. So to understand, as posthumanism has taught us, how technologies structure seeing, how technologies structure our thinking, knowledge, and our bodies, and so on, and our subjectivities. But what this window of perspective generated most importantly was the actual split between the object and the subject. So it generated a fixity of perception. It generated a fiction that the subject is positioned nowhere outside of reality, looking into everywhere, which is, of course, the great fiction of visual control that has permeated all our histories of colonization. Some of you might wonder, well, of course, we are subjects outside there, looking into everywhere. Well, I guess that's a problematic kind of fiction that hopefully future generations will look out, will look back and say, well, how could these people seriously think that? I think that we are never quite outside any reality. We are embedded in it. We are always part and constitutive part of it. And I think it's important to start finding ways of relating to the world in which we don't take for granted that we are external to what we are looking at. We are a constitutive part of what we are looking at, and vice versa. So it's very interesting how suddenly, when the eyes are no longer placed in the face, in a fixed framing with a certain kind of perspective and distance and so on, the whole perception of the body changes so radically that it can no longer still be the body of a subject, but it is a body without quite having a subject, which I think we never quite had. And, well, I can't go much more into this part now, but sometimes I've done this through telepresence processes. So what was going on through Skype or whatever, what was being projected were these amorphous, what I call post-anatomical movements, or microdata of the body, which the other person was was seeing. And the voice that you hear, and tomorrow I will show some videos, now it's impossible, was my own voice processed over the body's voice processed in real time, so that it became not quite intelligible as a human voice. So that, interestingly, generated a more presence-like feeling, I think, because there's the skin. The skin here is the frontier of the intelligible, the frontier that allows you to have some kind of presence going on there. But insofar as the skin is not quite recognizable, what kind of skin, what kind of body it is, there this person starts to shift from the recognizable into some more alien and interesting kinds of fields. So for me, this is a more successful project in terms of how to produce an account of presence that goes away from intelligibility, but still hints at some kind of presence, some sort. Let's quickly go through a few other things. Well, there's some other versions of the same, which I did in outdoor places, projecting the micro ability. The last version I did this year in Chile was without an audience, and this is very crucial for me as well, to avoid the spectacularity of the spectator position. So here, I was approaching the people who were going to the space where I was, one by one, and I was de-visualizing them, so I was approaching them with the cameras, and they were becoming the amorphous entity, and they were seeing how they were being de-visualized by this alien creature that was suddenly getting near to them. I think this issue of avoiding the spectacular framings is an important one, also if one wants to transform perceptions and perceptions and embodied kinds of relations. Okay, well, this is, I will quickly go through. We can go on now. This is just three things. Well, go backwards. Well, yeah, keep it for a moment.
Okay.
Just very quickly, we had this call for projects called Devisualize in the group which I coordinate in Media Lab Prado in Madrid, which is called Common Body. Now, Devisualize, of course, it was a provocation in some way, because as you may know, visualizing is very trendy in media arts nowadays, and of course in media culture altogether. Of course, this project was precisely about challenging the implications of not being quite critical enough what it means to be permanently visualizing everything, which is inherently a control paradigm. Do we need to visualize everything? What happens with these unactualized potentials of movement, which are irreducible to form? Of course, we cannot visualize them, but how do we set them into motion? This would be the crucial question. Now, just a few things to finish. Okay, yeah, the Metabody, this is, go backwards 1 minute. Metabody is a new project, we'll go on now, which we're starting hopefully next year with a very large consortium of institutions, 28 from 14 countries, of which hopefully Berkeley is one of the associated partners with PISA. And so this is a previous project, but it illustrates what we're getting to here. Now, in this project, I was working years ago with digital architectures. This is just projections on a translucent screen, so it looks like it were like a holographic projection or something, but it's not. But anyway, these digital structures are transformed interactively or reactively in relation to the movement of the dancer or performer. As you see, they are quite liquid, amorphous structures, and for me it was very, and still is very important in this kind of projects to never produce the kind of simulation of already known, of already given, replicated to saturation landscapes that one gets in video games, in 3D movies, and this kind of stuff. I think 3D and digital technologies give us enormous potentials to invent new kinds of reality that never existed before. And a reality not only in terms of what we see, of the represented, but of the relations that we establish with it. So the kinds of embodied relationalities that we establish in these environments. There's a huge universe there to discover, and unluckily, few efforts have been done in that direction. I mean, most of it, which of course even there that have been very interesting works done, but mostly in the direction of simulating and replicating already given representations of reality, not reality itself. What is reality? So, in this project, we want to explore, so this is like a further stage of the same process. How do these digital architectures eventually sediment into potential physical architectures? But always through exploring rather amorphous kinds of environments where the body doesn't find predefined affordances. And affordance is the quality of an object that allows you to, that invites you to interact with it in a particular way. So one could say that the affordance of the microphone invites